This is the meeting of the APCD Hearing Board. It's September 11th. It's 5:30 in the evening. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Gasparino? Here. Ms.
Here.
Neiswinder?
Here?
Dr. Shackman?
Here.
Mr. Stubblefield?
Here.
Mr. Herlock?
Will all those planning to give testimony tonight please rise to be sworn? And the clerk will give the oath.
You and each of you do solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give in the matters now pending before this board will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, we have two petitions on tonight. The first is petition number 786 from the city of Simi Valley. If I could first hear from staff on this. Actually, we go first with the petitioner. I'm sorry, I'm new at this. All right, this is representative from the city of Simi Valley then.
Good evening, the chair and the members of the board. My name is John Bejan, representing the city of Simi Valley. I'm a principal engineer, have been working on this project. I'm quite familiar with it. I'm here on behalf of the city to basically request your consideration of our variance, short variance, to allow us to remain on the existing, what they call interruptible rate with Southern California Edison Company until November. At that time, the city will decide whether we shall continue with I-6 engine and replace our existing standby engine generator with the new approved, APCD approved one, or just get out of I-6 or interruptible rate and maintain our existing engine. How would I turn it on? Sorry. Would you like me to repeat or? Okay. That's it. Basically, that's to summarize it. I'd be glad to answer any questions, specific questions you might have.
Does the board have any questions for petitioner?
Why didn't Simi Valley bring this up in February 2004 when the ATCM became law, or even at least by January of this year when the 0.15 grams per horsepower was mandated?
We have been in we have been in contact with APCD staff at least, because our intent was to not change the engine and apply and comply only with Tier 1. My intention was to actually get an engine that is good enough to 2008 or Tier 2 compliance, so we wouldn't have to spend taxpayers' money and replace the engine in 2 years. So, and that engine did not exist. As we speak, there's only one entity, I think it's Caterpillar, but I'm not quite sure, that has it. So when we found that availability of the engine, we actually applied for the permit, and we received it, I believe is in April of this year. The permit to construct a new engine.
So you'll have to buy that engine anyway in the fall if you decide to opt out of your I-6 contract, correct?
I don't believe so, because if we actually get out of I-6 contract, the existing engine is permitted by the APCD. However, we cannot use the existing engine, correct me if I'm wrong, to maintain I-6 contract with the Southern California Edison Company. Am I correct?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
What is the engine used for if not for compliance with the I-6 contract?
I-6 contract, basically this is our standby engine generator. Under I-6 contract, if we get a call, and we normally get a call maybe once every year, if that so far, when there's extreme heat or case that they're calling us to voluntarily get off the line so they can actually supply without, in other words, to minimize blackout. They normally give you 30 minutes warning to get off the line. And that way, while we're off, we use that engine to supply us with electrical needs. It has been permitted all the way till, I believe, this new regulations became effective.
And the decision of the city is contingent, I suppose, on the cost of the new engine, is that?
Correct. Cost of a new engine, I approximated about $500,000.
And the savings don't pencil out, or you're going to make that decision?
In my opinion, I'm an engineer, it does, because the saving alone is like $80,000 a year. If you just consider $80,000 a year expenditure and an initial cost of $500,000, to me, it's a good project. Rate of return is about 6 years.
Any of the other board members have any questions?
I have a question. Sorry it was late, but one of the findings that this board would need to make to grant this variance is that the applicant will reduce excess emissions to the maximum extent feasible. And I understand that you don't have any control over when ISO tells you to run the engine, but there are several other things that the engine is permitted for that are listed on page 6 of the draft variance, if I have the right version. Can you comment on which of these, if any, it would be feasible for you to make?
My apologies, I haven't read, but basically I know the process. There's only one case that we might be getting call from Southern California Edison Company and that's normally historically been when we get extreme heat. And that I do not anticipate from now till November to occur.
Excuse me, that's not what my question is.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought this was.
I understand that it's not feasible for you to not respond to ISO's request. I'm looking for you to tell me if any of the other conditions under which you operate this engine, such as for maintenance and test and for problems in your internal power distribution, you can reduce the emission of this engine. I think there are 4 or 5 other reasons that you're permitted to operate this engine. And are any of those feasible for reducing emissions?
The only way I can reduce the emission, short of mechanical filtration and everything, which is not feasible, would be minimizing its operation hours. That's the only. So I can actually minimize or basically eliminate the drills, which we normally do about once a month from here to November. Other than that, I don't anticipate, unless we get an emergency like there's a blackout, then we have to use the engine, which is above and beyond our control. Short of that, I don't anticipate or foresee it's operating at all for the next 90 days.
Well, in order for us to make this 5th finding, either you have to tell us that there's no feasible way you can reduce emissions, or that there are. And I'm looking for you to tell me whether you can feasibly reduce emissions from this engine and whether you will. Because it doesn't say that in the text on page 6.
Correct. Basically, the only way we can actually reduce the emission is not operating the engine as for the next 3 months, basically minimize or basically eliminate its use during this 90-day variance.
You're permitted to operate the engine when the facility's internal power distribution system fails. Is that feasible to be reduced?
No, sir.
You're permitted to operate it during pending periods of rotating power outages. Is it feasible to reduce that usage?
It hasn't happened for the past few years since I've been here, sir. So I can simply say Most likely that would not, but if it happens, we would have to use it, yes, because otherwise we would be in violation of our permit for to discharge raw sewage into the area of Simi. We cannot do that.
And another condition is when normal electrical service fails, is it feasible for you to reduce the operation of the engine under that condition?
No, sir, we're not. We have to use that.
And the other two are for maintenance and testing. Is it feasible for you to reduce the operation of the engine for those two purposes?
Yes, it is.
Can you do that?
Yes, sir.
Will you do that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, then I think I can make that finding. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question. Could you look at the top of page 7 of the draft short variance order, please?
Would you repeat? Was that the draft? My apologies. I am a late substitute for this, so I haven't had that much preparation for this. But go ahead.
Yeah, page 7, if you look at the very top of page 7, continuing from the other page, it says operation of the engine is not likely to create an immediate threat or hazard to public health or safety, and immediate has been underlined. However, research studies show that emissions from diesel-fueled engines may cause cancer in animals and humans. In addition, workers exposed to higher levels of emissions from diesel-fueled engines are more likely to develop lung cancer. Now, we have to make a finding that granting a variance would not present a threat to public health. Could you comment on the material on the top of page 7, please?
Yes, sir. I can assure you that, number one, we've been averaging basically for the past 3 years at least an hour of operation per year of this engine. I'm an engineer. I can actually tell you, and I have done that, what mass, total mass that's emitted to the environment. In my opinion, humble opinion, I'm a civil engineer registered with the state of California. I'm also an environmental engineer. The amount of pollution, carcinogenous pollution, that is absolutely negligible for 1 hour of operation of this engine. I can give you a comparison that is basically a truck that is averaging, 10 hours of operation in the state of California would put more in 1 day than we do in 1 hour, this engine. And as you know, we have plenty of trucks in the state of California, diesel truck that is. So I can assure you is, number one, we are not close to school. We are not close to any residential. We are extremely, really out of the way. In other words, we are in the west end of the city of Simi Valley, extremely industrial, surrounded by industries. So I can assure you there is really, this operation, if it happens, which would be an hour, at least averaging 1 hour, maximum 2 hours of operation, would not pose a major threat, carcinogenic or any other way, to the public.
Well, thank you for your comments. I'm going to ask the district when they have their turn
Sure.
to comment also. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Any further questions from the members of the board? Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Does the district have some comments on this project?
Maybe a couple of questions for Mr. Bijan. Can you explain how this engine operates within your plant? What type of service it provides in the plant, and why it's necessary to have this engine, and what the ramifications are if the engine doesn't operate during a power outage?
We are a wastewater treatment plant, and by the state of California Regional Water Quality Control Board are required to have a standby engine generator. And majority of times when we have a blackout, bottom line, there is no power available, this engine will come on, not automatically but manually, to supply the needed electricity to continue with our treatment plant. Our treatment plant, basically, we're dealing with live microorganisms, and we need to supply specifically fresh air or through our blowers, 150 horsepower engine blowers. We have 4 of them, and we have to have that continue operating. So whenever there is an electricity blackout, we have no choice but to use our standard engines and standby engine permitted by APCD.
Okay, thank you. Over the last several years, the data that you sent to me shows that your maintenance operations and even your emergency operations, but your maintenance operations have been less than 12 hours a year.
That is correct.
How frequently do you run the engine for maintenance purposes?
Basically, we try to average about an hour per month. That way, everything is tuned. We see the problem just in case, so it'll be ready for just in case for emergency.
Would you be able to commit to taking a limit during the variance period on the number of hours that you could do maintenance?
My intention is, at least my recommendations to the operation would be not using them for the next 90 days at all. No drills.
Okay. Those are all the questions I have at this point.
Not using the engine for 90 days, is that going to create any problem as far as maintenance of the machine is?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Yes, you had a question.
Yes, for Mr. Duval. You put the underline under immediate on the top of page 7.
Correct.
So you have some feelings about this. Would you tell us what you're thinking?
I underlined the word immediate because that's the criteria that's used in the health and safety code under this provision. That granting the variance will not create an immediate health hazard or threat. But I did want to let your board know that there are some research studies that show that there is a danger from diesel particulate emissions. And that's why I expanded on this. In addition, the California Air Resources Board has asked us to provide a little bit more information where necessary on health impacts from granting variances.
I'm surprised at the interpretation that a threat has to be immediate to be forbidden. For example, if we had a source that was spewing out a lot of asbestos, which we know will not cause someone to fall over dead in the next 15 minutes, but is a recognized carcinogen, I might understand we wouldn't attempt to prevent that asbestos emission.
I sure would not recommend the granting of a variance for a situation like that. But I understand what you're saying, yes.
And you're telling us that because the threat is not immediate, it's within the regulations to grant the variance.
What I'm trying to convey is that there are studies that show that there is a health threat from exposure to diesel particulate. In my estimation, the risk from several hours of operation in the next 90 days would be very insignificant as compared to the risk that people go through driving on the highways or just in the general areas where the public is allowed.
Yes. Following through on this line of questioning, I do want to ask about something that the petitioner said earlier when you were asked to confirm the state of the law, that they only have to put a cleaned up engine in if they want to be in one of these state programs that they are in. And that would mean they would be able to keep this more dirty engine indefinitely under the permitting rules, or is there a drop-dead date on that?
As the under the regulation and the city's permit, they're allowed to operate this engine for not more than 50 hours per year for maintenance and testing. They're allowed to operate it an unlimited amount for their own, I take that back, up to another 150 hours for their own power outages or system outages, you might say. They're allowed that 150 hours is also to include these California Independent System Operator calls for them to operate their engine. And to tell you the truth, I don't believe that the air toxic control measure is going to require them to replace their engine if they stay out of the interruptible service contract.
Ever have to replace their engine.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Any further comments from the board for the district?
I have a comment in the context of Mr. Duval's response. The representative from the city talked about level 4, level 2 or something. I didn't catch it exactly. What were you referring to as far as the changeover? It seems to address Dr. Shackman's question.
Yes, I was basically referring to APCD or the state boards or state laws of Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1, I believe it's 0.15 grams per brake horsepower.
That's correct.
Which is basically due, and it's now in effect. Whereas in 2008, that's going to be less. I believe it's 0.015. I can't remember now exact number, but that's going to be changed in 2008. That's called Tier 2.
And Mr. Duval, your understanding is that neither of these levels apply for a stationary emergency diesel generator in this district, or will in the future?
Those standards will not apply to what are referred to as in-use stationary generators over 50 horsepower. So if the city got off of their interruptible service contract, they would not have to replace their engine under the air toxic control measure.
Thank you. Thank you. Just for my information, is it possible, this is for Mr. Duval, I think, is it possible for the same facility to be asked to, maybe I should back up a little bit. When the ISO directs a I-6 contractor to use their engine, does that power go back into the grid, or is it used locally?
I believe, well, in some instances, some of the power goes back into the grid. In some instances, they use the engine just to power their own operation. And I'm not sure exactly how the city is set up.
I can answer that question. Basically, especially during the heat, we're averaging about 1,000 megawatt of electricity per day. And when they ask us to get off, so obviously we show zero use. So they'll be using that 1,000, whatever goes into the grid, as you mentioned. And during that time, we're using the existing engine to supply us with the needed electricity.
Mr. Bijan, when you're called upon by the state to run the engine, so you're generating back to you're using, it generates about 1,000 kilowatts?
The capacity of the engine is 1.6 megawatt or 1,600 kilowatt.
Okay.
However, we won't be needing more than 1,000 at the most. But in other words, when they tell us to get off the grid, and they normally give us about half hour, we need that for, I guess, to prepare the engine. And so we get off their grid completely. So they'll see 1,000 kilowatt less electricity used.
Okay. So you're not selling back
No, sir.
to the grid?
No,
Okay.
sir. No, sir. Ours is strictly to satisfy the need within.
Okay.
Can I then try to understand, the facility permit allows them to operate this engine during pending periods of rotating power outages, and the way that's worded, it appears to be independent of their I-6 obligations. Is that, do I understand that correctly?
That is That is somewhat dependent on their, I believe that's dependent on their I-6 contract. They're allowed, under the state regulation, they're allowed 30 minutes to bring their engine up to speed. Once Edison gives them the the advance warning, they're allowed a 30-minute period to bring the engine up to speed and you might say disconnect from the grid. So that's the statement about the pending outage.
So that 30 minutes is permitted, sort of independent of the I-6 contract, but not really.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, any further comments from the board?
Yes, I have a,
Mr. Gasparito.
thank you. I have a question for the petitioner. Reading through this, looking at the pounds per hour and everything, I understand all this, being an engineer myself and also working at a sewage treatment plant for many years. A question I've got is your statement that you're recommending that you do not perform any of the maintenance tests over the next 90 days. Is that, are you representing the city of Simi Valley, or is that your recommendation that's going to go back to the city? Because
Well,
that's what
I
I'm
guess I
concerned.
have been given the authority to sit here and represent them, and basically what, or to be here and represent them, excuse me. I'm anticipating, again, that there's a good possibility we get off I-6 completely. So, and I'm saying at that time, in November, we can tell. As I said, most of our drills and everything has been in anticipation of, for instance, blackout, and that normally happens during the summer, not with the heat, not November, or not October, not September. So I am really taking a little chance, the engine might, but I doubt that very seriously. We haven't really gone practicing every month this drill, 1 hour drill. There have been cases that we missed 1 or 2 months with no problem, no consequence.
But the intent, again, is as a representative from the city and as the engineer concerned with the facility itself, is that you will not perform any of the routine maintenance or
Correct.
use that engine during that period of time. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Mr. Stubblefield.
Do you have any idea how much money Semi saves a year by being a part of this, by having this I-6 contract? You get a reduced rate, right?
Correct.
And you're consuming 1,000 kilowatt hours a day?
Correct, but that's a peak. However, my calculation, basic calculation, shows me about $80,000 per year saving being an I-6.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And my question follows up on that. You said as an engineer, you felt the payback time of 6 years for buying the new engine and to keep those $80,000 in savings each year made it a good project.
Yes, sir.
That would keep you in the I-6 program.
That is correct.
But is the city ready to commit to doing that?
I can, because as I'm just an engineer. I prepared the staff report. I got the permit from you, from the APCD for a new engine. But again, city manager's office decided that they wants to they still evaluating it. My recommendation was both, because economically is feasible and definitely environmentally is advisable. So that's my job to recommend that to the city. But I cannot make that decision.
Yes, what concerns me is that diesel emissions are no longer a controversial issue. They're generally accepted as something undesirable that need to be controlled. And so regulations have been put in effect to lead people who have diesel engines to put in cleaner diesel engines. But there's a loophole, a little thing that you can weasel out under our county permit situation, that if you get out of the I-6 contract, you can keep this dirtier engine indefinitely. That bothers me. And we'll have to ask the district to what extent the hearing board could do something that would apply pressure on the city to get the new engine. But thank you.
My pleasure.
It concerns me also because what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is that if we were to grant this short variance, after the 90 days, the city of Simi Valley might very well decide to opt out of the I-6 contract, keep the old diesel generator, and we're back to square one, essentially.
I have not recommended that, sir. In my staff report, I have highly recommended replacing the existing engine. As I mentioned before, it is economically feasible to replace it with a new engine, as well as environmentally responsible.
But they could decide, for
That's
whatever
correct.
reasons,
That is
that they don't want to spend the money.
That's correct. But that would be even economically not a good decision, in my opinion, but that's my opinion.
Thank you.
Dr. Shackman.
For the district, then, is there anything the district can do, or that you'd recommend the hearing board would do to make it more likely that the engine will be replaced?
I don't see any leverage that the district has to require them to replace the engine. There's no regulation that calls for replacement of the engine. I don't think there's any action that the hearing board can take that would force that engine or force that change. As long as they adhere to the district rules and regulations, the air toxic control measure, and their permit to operate, I don't see that there's a way for us to force them out or force them to change.
Thank you.
And I might add that the state, the air toxic control measure for the stationary diesel engines was debated quite a bit up at the Air Resources Board, a number of public hearings and workshops. And I imagine that this issue was probably well discussed from the local environmental groups, wanting to see these dirtier diesel engines replaced altogether.
Mr. Herlock, more comments?
Yes, I had a question for the representative of the petitioner. Has this item been on the city council agenda other than a consent item?
It has not reached the city council, themselves, because it didn't. My staff report just stopped at the city managers.
Do you know if it is planned to be on an agenda in a future city council meeting that's not a consent item?
I'm sure that'll happen if you give us the grant us the variance in November. At that time, they have to make a decision. One way or another, they have to make a decision.
Thank you.
Do we have anything? Mr. Stubblefield.
Speaking for myself, I'd be more comfortable if tonight you could tell us that the city council is taking this seriously, that it is on the agenda as an action item, that they intend to do the right thing, get the new engine. I mean, even though granted, that's going to take some time to shop around and get the right one and get the contract signed and so forth, but right now there's no promises. So this short-term variance, I mean, you could be back here in 90 days asking for another variance.
I don't believe I have any justification for it, or the city would, because in November, we either have to keep the I-6 or get out. If we keep it, we have no choice but to change the engine. If we get out, as Mr. Duval explained, that means we will be allowed to use the existing engine, the dirty engine.
For how long?
Forever.
Indefinitely.
Correct.
Indefinitely.
Till the regulations change.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, with that, are any members of the public interested in speaking? Our member of the public is sitting here. All right, if not, then we will call the hearing closed. Any discussion by the board on this issue?
I have a observation. It appears that the recent identification by the California Air Resources Board of diesel particulate matter as a toxic with 0 as the allowed level makes it difficult for us to make one of the findings here, and we'll continue to do so. Most of the toxics have been given some level of tolerance, and so far diesel particulate has been identified as a toxic, and the safe level is 0. And at this point, that's just an observation. But it makes it difficult to make the finding that Dr. Shackman was questioning.
And
I agree with that. We have great difficulty making that finding.
As a practical matter, however, and I hate to step away from the environmentally correct and right thing to do, but as a practical matter, what we have on a daily basis is diesel particulates being pumped into the air by so many sources that it's almost impossible to track. In this particular situation, we have an engine that is only called upon to operate once a year. The likelihood of it being called upon to operate in the next 90 days is almost zero, and the engine operation that is left in that 90-day period is for, at most, an hour per month of maintenance to ensure that the engine does perform in an emergency, which is critical because of the type of engine that it is and what it does. Therefore, I don't have any problem making this particular finding, because I'm not seeing any difference between what was happening a year ago and what's happening now. And the likelihood, again, of this engine being called upon to operate in the next 90 days is minimal, from what I'm hearing. Because my fellow board members are so firm on this issue, I think I must be missing something. So perhaps if somebody wants to make some more comments, we can get somewhere.
Well, I'd be more comfortable with the analysis you just went through if we knew that after the 90-day period, the city would put in the new cleaner engine that's going to be compliant with continued participation in I-6, but it's quite possible they won't do that.
And if they don't operate, if they don't continue the contract with I-6, then the engine will be used only for maintenance and emergencies for the lifetime of the plant or until the regulations change at the state level.
I wouldn't underestimate that part, or emergencies, because power demand continues to grow in California, and power supply can lag behind, and emergencies may happen more and more often and for greater periods of time, and they'll have this permit that allows them to just continue operating the engine. Mr. Duval says there's nothing this hearing board can do in its authority to affect that.
See, I guess that's where my problem is, that the variance, if we don't grant the variance, and at the end of the 90-day period, they cancel the I-6 contract, that current machine is permitted and will continue to stay permitted and is not in violation of anything, so the variance is, the need for the variance ends. Am I correct, Mr. Duval?
That's correct.
Okay. So I'm not sure we, as a hearing board, can do a lot about this particular problem.
That's what I understand. That's why it's attractive to simply enforce the rules which say that we have to be able to make a finding about public health, which is a stretch to make.
Understood. Thank you. Mr. Stubblefield, Mr. Hillock?
I wanted to ask Mr. Oriano a question. Do you believe it's in the authority of this board, I'll say, to include a requirement that this item be agendized on a city council meeting?
The state law does give you wide latitude to consider other things, and certainly you could put a suggestion in. I don't think that, obviously, because it wouldn't even be heard till after the variance period was ending, it would operate as an effective control on the granting of the variance. In addition, what did strike me as supporting a possible finding was the fact that they were willing to forego the maintenance and other use in the period of the variance that they have a right to do without the order, so that if you condition it to that purpose, you can eliminate the concern about numbers 7 and 8, the nuisance and the immediate threat or hazard, because you're actually offsetting the allowed use that wouldn't even require a variance. And I thought you got a commitment from the applicant to do that, even though they're not required otherwise. But other than that, I had the same difficulty with what was presented, and you're making that finding.
Could you recommend the language change in the document that would be required for the purpose you just stated?
Well, it's in number 5, and it would be, as was the question of the applicant, that they make a firm commitment to having no use for maintenance and testing.
What page is that?
It's on page 6 of the draft short variance ordinance I have.
Okay.
Your board went through and questioned them on each of those items, and the last two for maintenance or testing was where they said they could eliminate them.
So the language would now read how?
The applicant will eliminate use for maintenance and testing and will reduce, well, let's see, let me think about it carefully. You would, I guess, put an or before the when normal electric services fails, and then put a comma after fails, and put and eliminate the use for maintenance and testing.
You solved the problem for me.
So,
I would encourage you to open back the hearing, at least to the point to get the firm commitment that they agree to that condition before you put it in.
If I could ask counsel, was that not the question that I posed to the petitioner? And the response was that they would not use it during that period of time?
That's what I thought I heard.
I think we do have that firm commitment from the applicant. In regards to number 8, Dr. Shackman, are you bound, I suppose, all members of the board, is everyone comfortable with the finding in paragraph 8?
I am with the commitment that we're now putting into 5.
Mr. Herlock?
Yes, I just looked at the findings in the big blue book here, and on page, item 8, it says operation, and in the findings, it says continued operation. The fact of the matter is that it's unlikely that there will be operation, as you pointed out. But this finding says operation, so I don't know what we can, it's just language at this point. I don't think it makes any difference in practice.
Further comments, questions, changes to the proposed order? Is there a motion concerning the petition?
I'll make a motion to adopt the draft short variance order with the changes that our council has given.
Second.
If I can make one further comment on that, I should also say that that should be put in the conclusions and order section under A1.
I guess I would second as further clarified by counsel.
Dr. Shackman, would you accept that modification?
Yes.
Are we going to put in Mr. Herlock's suggestion that the board recommends that you go back and tell the city council that we'd like to see this item put on the agenda for consideration? We're in a difficult position here because Simi Valley has the worst air quality of any municipality in Ventura County, with the possible exception some days of Ojai. So every little bit counts. And granted, you're rolling the dice here, and probably it's a good gamble. Probably there won't be any extreme power outages or heat waves, but this could backfire on us. I just think we need to keep that in mind.
I don't think it's our role to make a recommendation to the city council to put something on their agenda. So I'd rather leave my motion just the way it is.
I believe I heard the petitioner indicate that come November anyway it was going to be on the agenda because the decision has to be made.
Correct.
And I was even thinking whether or not we could get feedback through staff, but I guess we can't do that either. But I would like to let Madam Chair know I am totally in line with her earlier reasoning for moving forward with this variance.
We do have a motion, Dr. Shackman's motion, on the table without any modifications by Mr. Stubblefield. We have a second from Mr. Gasparino. And would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Gasparino,
Aye.
Dr. Chapman,
Aye.
Ms. Nicewinder,
Aye.
Mr. Stubblefield,
Aye.
and Mr. Hurlock.
Aye.
Okay. Your petition has been granted. I'm certain that Mr. Duval will be getting you all the necessary paperwork, and we thank you for your time tonight.
And thank you very much.
We do have a second matter on calendar, which appears to be an echo of the first. We could shortcut all this and just make the same changes to the order, but I don't think that works. The second petition is number 787. It's filed by the County of Ventura. And if you could identify yourself and let us know what the petition's about.
Good evening. My name is Roy Marsh. I'm the Public Works Superintendent in the Water and Sanitation Department for the County of Ventura. We currently have a standby emergency generator that's on the I-6 contract at a lift station in Moore Park. This engine has not run on that contract in the last 5 years. So it's unlikely that it would happen, but it could during this period for the variance. Pretty much like the city of Simi, it's there to protect health and safety of the overflow of a lift station should it lose power. And we cannot decide whether that runs or not when ISO calls for it to run. It has automatic switchover equipment that they control, so we cannot override that. So we can't make that decision to run it during that period if called on.
You haven't run that particular engine then for 5 years?
It has not been called on by ISO to run in the last 5 years.
And what is your normal operating use of that machine?
It is there just strictly as standby power, and we do run it once a month for approximately an hour, just as the city of Simi, to make sure that if there is an emergency, that it will run.
Seems to be a somewhat cleaner engine than the one that Simi has. Is there any discussion of replacing this engine? No.
There has been none.
Okay, does the board have any questions for petitioners?
Does your answer to Ms. Nicewinder's question mean that the city plans to opt out of the I-6 contract in November?
Oh, I'm sorry. The county is going to opt out of the I-6 contract in November.
That decision has been made?
That decision has been made, and that is what I take care of in my department. So I will do that personally with Southern California Edison. And I signed that contract.
Was that decision a result of a recommendation out of your organization?
That's correct.
And so is it, I believe you probably heard the previous petitioner's kind of cost-benefit analysis. Is yours different, or?
No, we would opt out of this I-6 contract knowing what is there now, what these regulations are. Then that would be my recommendation, to opt out of it, knowing these regulations as they stand today.
Does the fact that you haven't been asked to run it does your I-6 contract save the county money in spite of the fact that you've not been asked to run the engine?
I do not know, but I believe we do get a better rate.
So you haven't done a cost-benefit analysis?
No.
Thank you.
Further questions from the board of the petitioner? Dr.
Yeah,
Shackman?
I don't understand then why you're recommending opting out of the program.
Because we would be in violation if we did run, if required to run, not asked to run, but if we required to run by ISO, then we would be in violation.
But the next question then is, you could replace the engine, just as CME is doing.
Would you say, would we replace the engine?
I say you could replace the engine. That's your option.
Yes,
Then you
that
wouldn't
is
be
an
in
option.
violation.
Right, that is an option.
So have you evaluated that option?
To the point that the director of the department did not say that we were going to replace that engine. That is not my decision to make.
Thank you.
Further questions? Any questions of the district for the petitioner?
Again, can you just give a brief description of how this engine operates within the plant and why it's necessary for it to operate, how it provides security for the plant?
Sure. This is a sewer lift station, and it has to constantly operate to move the sewage along to the sewage treatment plant. If that facility was to lose power, Edison power, then that sewage would then back up and could overflow into the arroyo. So it's a health and safety reason that it's there. And it's to keep the plant pumps running, the large pumps that operate the sewer lift station.
As in the discussion with the city of Simi Valley, would the county be willing to commit to not doing any test or maintenance operation of the engine?
If directed to do so in your variance, we would do that. But in my position, I would feel that I would be irresponsible in my job if I did not run that at least an hour a month to make sure that it ran if there was an emergency.
Okay. Those are all the questions I have at this point.
Let me follow up on that last question that you answered. Then in the next 90 days, as we are granting this short continuance or short variance, you would continue to operate the machine on a monthly basis?
I would like to continue to run it for an hour a month for maintenance to make sure that it functions properly. But if directed by the board, we would not run it.
Mr. Herlock.
In light of that response, can you help me through, on page 6, the finding 5? This board has to make the finding that the applicant will reduce excess emissions to the maximum extent feasible. And I haven't heard anything that, other than that we would have to find that there's nothing feasible you can do to reduce emissions.
There's nothing I know of that we can do to reduce emissions on that particular generator.
And reducing or eliminating maintenance and testing is not feasible in your opinion?
I just feel it would be irresponsible. for what is at stake.
So in order for us to make that finding, I think, at least in my mind, I would have to say that that the applicant will make no reductions because there are none feasible, and that then satisfies that finding.
Yes.
I'm still having trouble with, do you know how much the replacement engine would cost?
No, I do not. We have not gotten any quotes for new backup generators.
Tell me again how the decision has already been made not to replace the engine and not to continue the I-6 contract. What was the basis for that decision?
Not to replace the engine?
And not to
Okay, funds have not been budgeted to replace that engine. And the driving force to get out of that I-6 contract is to comply with current regulations, whether that had a financial impact or not.
Could you repeat?
Yes, we need to be out of the I-6 contract to comply with APCD regulations, which we would comply with, whether there was a savings or a penalty involved. We need to comply.
So the basis of the decision was only to comply with APCD regulations independent of any financial analysis as to benefits to the county of replacing the engine and continuing to save money on power.
Okay, I know that the savings on power, from what I was told by Southern California Edison representative, it was certainly not going to be enough to pay for a new engine.
In what period of time?
In a reasonable period of time. But I couldn't give you a time frame. I know that savings that we're getting at that lift station being on that I-6 contract, I can't tell you the dollar amount, but it is not a huge amount.
Okay. Thank you.
Clarifying point, you can't not turn that engine on. Did I hear you say that at the beginning?
That's correct. There's a switch over that is controlled, I believe, by a radio signal that is sent out that turns Edison off. And then that engine will automatically run on the I-6 contract, ISO. If ISO says they say that we need to turn off the power at that facility, they can do it.
Thank you. Any questions?
And that's because it's a lift station, there's no manpower there to manually turn it on and off,
That's
correct?
correct. It is a facility that somebody goes by once a day.
How many thousands of gallons of sewage go through that lift station per day?
I do not have that figure.
Does it receive a main line of sewage that comes from a particular area?
It's a substantial flow of Moore Park's sewage goes through that lift station.
How many hours of downtime without that lift station functioning before you said earlier, I believe, that it would back up into the Arroyo, which I had no idea how far away it is from the lift station?
Oh, it's right next to the Arroyo.
Okay.
So it's within feet, yards. It's less than 100 yards from the Arroyo. And I do not know how long it would take to fill it up if that power went out and we did not have emergency power.
Last question, if I may ask, Madam Chair. Your recommendation, because your public works, is to maintain the equipment, and there's an assurance factor that you need an hour's worth of operation per month.
Now, maybe that time could be cut down.
Well, that's where I was going, so I'm glad you said that before I asked. And the other thing is, I'm also for the board, I'm concerned about consistency between the two petitions, and that they are similar, even though one base horsepower motor is significantly less than the other. It looks like the decision's been made to opt out in November. So that's all I have for right now.
Any further comments from the board for the petitioner? Comments for the district? Comments
Madam Chair,
from the district?
If I could just make one comment to clarify something that Mr. Herlock said in the last hearing, and he expressed concern that the state had a zero threshold for diesel particulates. And I don't think in this air toxic control measure they intended to have a zero threshold, just by the fact that they have allowed operation of these engines for maintenance, testing, and different operations. So I think they recognize that there is a dire need for these engines in these types of situations and others, and I think they have recognized that there is a need for them and haven't set a zero threshold.
My use of zero was for health safety. I believe that the level for allowable, whether it's a toxic level or some other level, is not been established, and therefore it's zero.
Okay.
Another question, Mr. Stubblefield.
Mr. Duvall, so we have two cases tonight in which there are two separate standards, one by the state, this new air toxic control measure, the ATCM standard, 0.15 grams, and then we have a local standard that's a little more generous. Is there any coordination or communication between the county, APCD, and the state to maybe move our standard to the state standard? Are you recommending that to the board?
The county's permit to operate and City of Simi Valley's permit to operate mirror the requirements of the state air toxic control measure. We've incorporated the requirements of the air toxic control measure into their permit. The air toxic control measure does allow, I think, up to 50 hours per year operation for maintenance and testing, and that's what their permits allow. The allowance for operating under the interruptible service contract is the same in both permits. The air toxic control measure says that if they're going to operate their engine under an interruptible service contract, they have to meet 0.15 grams of diesel particulate, and that's the same in the ATCM and the permit. So we've made the two mirrors of each other.
But if they opt out of the I-6 contract, they're no longer
they will
subject to that 0.15 gram rule.
That's correct, and that's consistent with the air toxic control measure. The air toxic control measure would impose an hourly limit for maintenance and testing that's similar to the permit. So the air toxic control measure recognizes those units that are not in the I-6 contract and does allow them to be tested and operated for internal power disruptions and things like that.
And it's the view of the district that there's not a significant savings or reductions to be gained from just going to the 0.15 gram rule for everything, or it's just not cost effective?
I really don't think it would be cost effective to go to require an operator to, City of Simi Valley, because he had a figure $500,000 to reduce emissions for 50 hours per year of maintenance and testing, and when in actuality he's been running 12 hours a year. So I I haven't done the cost effectiveness, but I just don't think it would pencil out.
Thank you.
Further comments from the board? Either questions to the district or questions to the applicant? Do any members of the public wish to testify? We're back up. All right, I will call the hearing closed. Any discussion by the board?
I would like to see wording in item number 5, page 6, changed to reflect the recommendation and the positive comment from the petitioner that they're going to reduce their 1 hour per month to minimize the emission issue.
I'm afraid I did not hear a commitment to that.
I did, so maybe there could be some clarification then.
Yes. We would reduce that hour a month to, we could probably cut that in half.
I wrote 80%, yeah.
Okay.
So 30 minutes a month?
And sure, we can commit to that. It's not a problem.
Thank you. Anything else? I have some comments on page 5 of the draft order. Items 2 and 3. There are comments about penalties of $10 per kilowatt hour at a cost of question mark per year per hour in both those paragraphs.
Okay. Our first, I think the first draft that we sent out, or the first set that we sent out for the county of Ventura had some erroneous statements in there. That's what happens when you cut and paste from one to another. And we subsequently sent out a revised draft by email, I think on Wednesday, that removes those references to the $10 per hour and some of the question marks, and reflects some of the statements that Mr. Marsh has made tonight regarding how the engine operates, how the switches
That was
work.
my comment. Because of his representation that this thing goes on automatically,
Yeah.
these 2 paragraphs,
And-
as previously written, wouldn't apply. So
Yeah. And I have to apologize for that. We just goofed.
yeah, there's the same problem on page 6, item 4. So all 3 of them then were corrected to reflect the actual operation.
That's correct.
Great. Any other comments from the board as to the draft order? Any changes that we might request? Any suggestions?
I have a comment that the representative from CME seemed to have a cooperative attitude in working with us and made a commitment, which we incorporated in the language, using the language that Mr. Ariana gave us. And I don't have that same sense with the petitioner now from the county of Ventura, and we seem now to be on the verge of offering the county of Ventura a less restrictive order, only a 50% reduction. And that seems inappropriate to me, that we ought to treat both petitioners the same and use the same language here that we used in the prior order.
Comments from the board?
But the difference is we're talking about sewage here rather than simply providing heating and air conditioning and lights at City Hall and SEMI. Am I correct? I mean, that's your concern about the maintenance and testing.
Yes, this is for a sewer lift station, so it's, if this does not operate in an emergency, then sewage is going to flow down the creek. And
I believe it was the exact same project in Simi. They were also operating wastewater.
Yeah,
Water
like-
quality plant.
Yeah, they're operating a huge wastewater treatment plant in Simi Valley versus a lift station, and so they're using the large horsepower at the sewage treatment plant in Simi to provide air to feed the bugs at a treatment plant, which you can stop for a period of time. But if you got sewage coming down a big line, which is why I was trying to get a feel for the quantity, and that's automatic, and the power does not come on, then you have a serious problem, public health problem, visibility problem, negative problems, and that's why I suggested the 50% versus the 100% as previously.
So it's an engineering
it's an engineering kind of you could say that that's engineering reasoning, as my wife would tell me.
Well, I'm comfortable with that.
All right, any further discussion of the project itself? The order? In that case, do we have a motion concerning the petition?
The only suggestion I would make is that you specify the language, or have me specify the language for 5, and that would be to make a similar change in 5 and in the
A1.
conclusions in order, except to say that before the last, or after the last or, it would be, and limit use to 50% of the allowed 1 hour per month for maintenance and testing, of the otherwise allowed 1 hour per month for maintenance and testing. And my only equivocation there, or problem there, is that it seemed to me it was indicated to be more than 48 hours a year, so it would be more than 4 hours a month that are allowed, but that's the first I'd heard of that in the context. But if the applicant's willing to limit it to 30 minutes a month, then you might just specify for no more than 30 minutes per month for maintenance and testing.
That would be my preference. I mean, that's what the commitment is 30 minutes a month, just through November, and that would be the way I'd like to see it written.
And then you eliminate in 2 on the conclusions, as with the other one, the or for maintenance and testing, so that's not available. And, I'm sorry, you limit that to 30 minutes for maintenance and testing in both places. Slightly different than the other.
Okay. Do we have a motion on the order as proposed by Mr. Oriana through his revisions?
So move.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Would the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Gasparino?
Aye.
Ms. Neiswender?
Aye.
Dr. Shackman?
Aye.
Michael Stubblefield?
Aye.
Mr. Hurlock?
Aye.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
With those 2 petitions, we have any further comment from the members of the public? Any comments from the board about anything?
I would like my cheat sheet back, though.
Oh, you get your cheat sheet back. Do you want to discuss this now? Actually, it might be a good idea to discuss this fairness in the air next time we come back, since obviously, I don't think any of us have read it, the 50-page document.
If I can just make a comment. First of all, who made the motion on the last hearing?
Gasparino.
Okay, thank you.
By Stubblefield.
And second,
Okay. Mr. Gasparino. The second was
Mr. Stubblefield.
Stubblefield. Okay. Yeah, we provided you with a fairly lengthy document from Mr. Monaster. I think he's a law professor up in the Bay Area. The ARB's hearing board handbook, their hearing board training course, for years has included an older version of this, and I guess he's recently updated it and made it much larger. And we thought it might be interesting for your board to have that to read at your leisure and see what he has to say about it. We have no other hearings scheduled at this time.
When did I end up as chair?
The last meeting, you didn't show up.
Oh, good for me.
I must admit, though, on my behalf, they wanted me to be chair, and I thought it would be better for you to be in that position.
Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
I wasn't here either.
Ah. All right, well, with that, we will call the hearing closed.